Hi, everybody. It is time for chapter 5 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about language. So, you may have noticed that there's words in the story that are used maybe differently than we use words right now. Think about this. This book was written over 70 years ago. So, if it was published in 1950 and it's now 2020, think about when that was written, this book. Also think that this book was written by an Englishman. So even though they speak English, it's not American style English, it's English style English, which means there's going to be nuances on how words are used, or perhaps even words that we don't use right now in 2020 here in the Northwest of America. The example I'm thinking of is the phrase the wood. They talk a lot about, oh, we met in the wood, or we walked through the wood. And I think you've probably figured out by now that that means the forest. So 70 years ago in England, they might not say, I walked through the forest. They might say, I trekked through the wood. Now, as good readers, you're going to be listening to the story, thinking about the meaning of words, and trying to infer definitions about how words are used. I find that really interesting, and I think you will too. And I think that the story, even though it's 70 years old, even though it's written in England and there's some differences in how words are used, just slight differences, it's still such a wonderful story today as it was when it was written and first published all those years ago. All right, let's get back to it. Chapter 5, Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out.
Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there in the wood. Go on, Edmund. Tell them all about it.
What's all this about, Ed? Said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to this moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. Tell us, Ed, said Susan, and Edmund gave a very superior look as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, Oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really. Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success, and went on at once to say, There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of these young kids. They always... Look here, said Peter, turning on him savagely. Shut up. Shut up. Means the same now as it did 70 years ago in England. All right, moving on. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite. But it's all nonsense, said Edmund, very taken aback. Of course it's all nonsense, said Peter. That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home. But since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering at her and nagging at her one day and then encouraging her the next? I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. You didn't think of anything at all, said Peter. It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now. Ooh, so we just found out that Edmund can be a bit of a bully. But let's go with the story here. Do stop it, said Susan. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story, and she said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stay there, because you are all beasts. Beasts!" It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working out as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to Father if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." And the professor said, So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them, and he said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together, never interrupting till they had finished the whole story. After that he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," said Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said that they were only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as more reliable? I mean, which is more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing, sir," said Peter. "Up until now, I'd have said Lucy, every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That is more than I know," said the professor. "And a charge of lying against someone whom has always been very truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed." "We were afraid it mightn't have been lying," said Susan. "We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean?" said the professor quite coolly. "Oh, you can't make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. Now, mad doesn't mean like, mad. It means mad crazy. And if you're a fan of Harry Potter's, you already know that mad does not mean angry. It means crazy. But back to the story. "But then," said Susan, and she stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. "Logic!" said the professor, half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, and then unless further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling us the truth." Susan looked at him very hard, and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how could it be true, sir?" said Peter. "Why do you say that?" said the professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was real, why doesn't everybody find this country every time they go to the wardrobe? I mean, there's nothing there when we looked, and even Lucy didn't pretend that there was." "What has that got to do with it?" asked the professor. "Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time." "Are they?" asked the professor, and Peter did not know quite what to say. "But
There was no time, said Susan. Lucy's had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours.
That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If, I say, she has got into another world, I should not at all be surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story.
But do you mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place? Just around the corner? Like that?
Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what do they teach them in these schools? Now, I want to show you a picture. There is a picture of Peter and Susan talking to the professor. Okay. All right, back to the story.
But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get a little off point.
My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying.
What's that? asked Susan.
We might all try minding our own business, he said. And that was the end of the conversation.
Oh. Okay. Now, again, if, for those of you in my classroom, you know that MYOB is a real thing, right? MYOB, mind your own business, right? We love each other. We take care of each other. We're kind to each other. But there's times when you just have to MYOB, mind your own business. All right, kiddos, on that note, seems like a good place to stop. We're not done with chapter 5 yet. We have a few more pages, but I think we'll get through chapter 5, and I don't know, chapter 6 is one of my favorites. All right, see you guys all tomorrow. Have a good day.